Story 1. The detectives storm the house with a precise goal. They move fast, methodical, as if time is running out. They can feel it now, the unease creeping in, the sensation that something is hidden, something crucial just out of sight. It's when they reach the master bedroom, and the officer pulls out a small, worn notebook from beneath the bed that the real questions begin. This is where the truth could be waiting. This is where the lies could unravel. June 3rd, 2022. It was a Tuesday morning in Mariner's Bluff, the kind of morning where the mist clings to the water and the air smells like salt and wet wood. People were out walking their dogs, joggers making their usual rounds, seagulls picking through yesterday's scraps. Nothing felt out of place, except for the empty dock. Hannah Brooks and her 9-year-old daughter Journey had set out the previous day on a fishing trip, a girls-only outing that had become their summer tradition. Friends said Hannah was excited, a little tense maybe, but determined to make memories with her daughter. The kind of memories she felt slipping away as her marriage to Darius grew more strained. That morning, Darius stood at the edge of the dock, eyes fixed on the horizon. The tide was higher than usual, churning with the remnants of yesterday's storm. In his hand, a single fishing rod, Hannah's. He said he'd found it washed ashore, tangled in seaweed. The line snapped. No boat, no bodies, no sign of his wife or daughter. Authorities were called, and soon patrol boats combed the waters. Helicopters hovered overhead. The Coast Guard issued a statement. A small vessel matching the description of Hannah's boat was found in pieces, drifting miles away, near the Outer Banks. But what they didn't find was more unsettling than what they did. Darius stood by, eyes red, voice shaking, clutching that fishing rod like a lifeline. He told them it was just a fishing trip, a harmless afternoon that went wrong. He said Hannah knew how to handle a boat. He said Journey was a strong swimmer. But he didn't say why Hannah and Journey went out in a storm. He didn't say why he wasn't with them. Neighbors began to gather, whispering behind cupped hands. Mariner's Bluff is a town where people know each other's business, where gossip spreads quicker than high tide. And as search crews continued scouring the water, a crowd formed at the dock. Some came to help, others just to watch. They huddled together, eyes darting from the waves to Darius, then back again. A woman in a floral housecoat, arms folded tight against her chest, muttered to another, "They don't just disappear. Not both of them. Not like this." Meanwhile, Vanessa Brooks stood alone, away from the crowd, fingers tapping against the screen of her phone. To anyone watching, she seemed lost in thought, maybe grief. But those who knew her said she looked distracted. And when someone asked where she'd been when her sister and niece went missing, Vanessa only shook her head and said, "I was at work. I had no idea they even left." The search continued into the night, floodlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating patches of the churning sea. And as each hour passed, hope ebbed away like the receding tide. By morning, all they had was the fishing rod, a few scraps of the boat, and 2 names added to the missing persons list. 2 days later, a closed casket memorial was held at Mariner's Bluff Community Church. The congregation sang hymns, the preacher spoke of life's unpredictability, and Darius wept into his hands as the choir sang Amazing Grace. Vanessa sat in the front row, eyes dry, hands folded neatly in her lap. Afterward, while mourners filed out and the organist played soft, somber chords, a group of Hannah's friends gathered in the parking lot. One of them, a childhood friend named Marla, said Hannah had called her the night before the trip, said she was scared, said she'd found out something terrible, something that could tear her family apart. But before Marla could explain, Vanessa appeared behind them. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes fixed on Marla. Marla said nothing. The other women looked down, and Vanessa walked away, a slight smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Days passed, then weeks. The ocean gave nothing back, the town tried to move on, but questions lingered. Why did Hannah go out alone in a storm? Why didn't anyone see Journey leave the house? And why was Darius seen at a bar miles down the coast, laughing and dancing with Vanessa the very night his wife and daughter went missing? Hannah Brooks was the kind of woman people in Mariner's Bluff trusted. Raised in the same town where she eventually started her own family, she was the eldest daughter of a devout church-going family. Soft-spoken and kind-hearted, she worked as receptionist at a pediatric clinic, balancing her job with being a full-time mother to her daughter, Journey. For Hannah, family was everything. She was the type to bring casseroles to neighbors, volunteer for church events, and organize birthday parties with homemade cupcakes and handwritten invitations. But behind closed doors, her life was far from picture perfect. Journey Brooks was 9 years old, a bright and curious little girl with big eyes and an infectious laugh. She was the kind of child who asked too many questions and made friends easily. At school, she was known as the girl who could make anyone smile. But at home, Journey had become more withdrawn in recent months, her eyes often lingering on the door, waiting for her father to come home. She loved to draw, filling notebooks with crayon sketches of boats and lighthouses, a world she said she wanted to explore someday. For Journey, her mother was her world, her protector, the only constant in a home that felt increasingly unpredictable. Darius Brooks wasn't born in Mariner's Bluff. He came from Charleston looking for a fresh start. When he met Hannah, he was committed to building a better life. Though he had a low-paying secretary job, he worked hard and did his best to provide for his new family. He wasn't wealthy, but he was responsible, and he loved his wife and daughter deeply. To the outside world, Darius may have seemed like a man trying to stay afloat, but to Hannah, he was the man she believed in and stood by, despite the challenges. Vanessa Brooks was the younger sister, the one who always seemed to live in Hannah's shadow. While Hannah was the dependable, responsible older sibling who stayed in Mariner's Bluff, Vanessa was the wild one, the pretty one, the one who couldn't seem to stay in one place for too long. She was the girl who always had a new boyfriend, a new job, a new excuse for why she couldn't quite get her life together. Barely 24 hours after Hannah and Journey were declared missing, Darius was seen partying and drinking with Vanessa. A bartender named Lyle, who served them that night, later told police, "I remember thinking, man, that guy's wife and kid are missing. And he's in here, drinking shots and dancing like it's a celebration." 1 month later, when Darius and Vanessa walked hand in hand into the county courthouse, smiling like newlyweds, the whispers turned to shouts. Mariner's Bluff had lost a mother and daughter to the sea, but now they were about to lose their illusions about Darius and Vanessa. Because that marriage wasn't just a vow, it was a declaration. A declaration that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The investigation was still ongoing in the background. Darius and Vanessa were the primary suspects, and they wasted no time in inviting them for investigation. Inside the dimly lit station, Detective Sharon Liu was sifting through Vanessa's phone records. Most of her text messages had been deleted, but a forensic tech had managed to recover fragments from her WhatsApp account. 2 texts stood out. The first, "After she gone, it's just us." The second, "You better handle it clean, Tyrone. I did my part at the office." Detective Liu read the messages aloud, her eyes narrowing. "After she gone," she muttered, rolling the words over in her mind. The language was casual, almost flippant. Not the way someone talks about a sister and a niece who vanished at sea. But it was the second message that sent a chill down her spine. The one about Tyrone and handling it clean. Lou grabbed a marker and wrote the words on the whiteboard, drawing a line from Vanessa's name to Tyrone Mason, a man whose name was already on their radar. Tyrone Mason, ex-con, former dockhand, a man with a history of violence and a connection to Vanessa that was becoming harder to ignore. Detective Liu pulled up Tyrone's financial records. That's when she saw it. A $20,000 cash deposit made 3 days before Hannah and Journey's disappearance. The source? Darius Brooks. The reason? Blank. Liu's jaw clenched. $20,000 in cash. No explanation. No paper trail. Just a transfer from Darius's account to Tyrone's. Days before Hannah and Journey set sail, Detective Wiggins joined Liu in the evidence room, his eyes scanning the board. $20,000, Liu said, tapping the printout. What was it for? Wiggins shook his head, staring at the timeline laid out before them. The footage of Darius and Vanessa partying the night of the disappearance. The text from Vanessa's phone. The cash deposit to Tyrone. It was all there, in black and white. And yet, when questioned, Darius swore he was home the night of the storm, pacing the living room, calling out to God to bring his family back. But the footage told a different story. Darius and Vanessa were at the bar until 2 a.m., laughing, drinking, dancing. At one point, Vanessa pulled Darius onto the dance floor, their bodies pressed close, her head resting against his shoulder, his hands gripping her waist. They didn't look like people whose loved ones had just vanished. They looked like people celebrating. Outside the station, the media frenzy was growing. Reporters gathered in clusters, shoving microphones toward anyone who walked through the door. Why did Darius and Vanessa get married so quickly? One reporter shouted, his voice echoing through the parking lot. Did Vanessa benefit from the insurance payout? Another called out, flashing a camera in Detective Wiggins' face. Inside the house Darius and Vanessa now shared, the blinds were drawn, the curtains pulled tight. Neighbors walked by, glancing up at the darkened windows, whispering to one another. Theories spread through Mariner's Bluff like wildfire. What started as whispers around coffee tables and church pews soon became the talk of town. Was it an accident? Did Hannah and Journey really get caught in a storm that fateful afternoon, the boat capsizing, dragging them both down into the churning sea? It was a story that was easy to believe. Mariner's Bluff had seen its share of tragedies at sea. Boats going under, men overboard, lives lost to unpredictable waters. But two people, a mother and her child, both disappearing without a trace? That was harder to swallow. And then there was the fact that the storm warnings hadn't been severe that day. Weather reports indicated gusty winds and choppy waves, but nothing strong enough to capsize a boat. Fishermen who had been out that morning said the waters were rough but navigable. And Hannah wasn't new to boating. She grew up on the water, learning to fish from her father, steering a boat before she could ride a bike. People began to wonder why an experienced boater like Hannah would head out to sea with her daughter in conditions that others deemed risky. Was she really that reckless? Or did someone make her believe it was safe to go? The other theory was darker, more deliberate. Did Darius and Vanessa plan it all? There was the insurance payout, $1 million, filed by Vanessa just weeks before the trip. There was surveillance footage of Darius and Vanessa at the bar, laughing, dancing, drinking, while search crews scoured the water for Hannah and Journey. There was Vanessa's quick transition from grieving sister to blushing bride, walking down the courthouse steps with Darius just a month after the memorial service. People in town started connecting the dots. Was the fishing trip just a cover? Did Darius and Vanessa conspire to get rid of Hannah and Journey for the money? And if they did, why didn't they wait? Why the rush to collect the insurance money, to get married, to move on? Vanessa's role in all of this remained murky. Was she the mastermind, using her sister's death to cash in on the insurance and trap Darius in a marriage he never wanted? Or was she just a pawn, a woman caught between two men, one who wanted her love and one who wanted her silence? As the investigation continued, Tyrone was brought in for questioning. He sat across from Detective Wiggins, his eyes darting to the one-way mirror, sweat glistening on his brow. When asked where he was the day of the fishing trip, Tyrone claimed he was home, nursing a hangover, watching TV. But his phone records told a different story. Tyrone's phone pinged near the docks that morning, around the time Hannah and Journey were setting out to sea, and there was another ping, 2 hours later, from a spot 20 miles south, the same area where the boat wreckage was found. When confronted with the cash withdrawals, Tyrone shifted in his seat, his leg bouncing beneath the table. "I don't know nothing about that," he said, eyes downcast. "But when detectives mentioned Vanessa's text, you better handle it clean, Tyrone." "I did my part at the office." Tyrone's jaw clenched, his fists tightening in his lap. He looked up at the ceiling, took a deep breath and said, "She set me up. That money wasn't payment, it was a loan. Darius owed me money. Vanessa told me to ask him for it." The confession was shaky, filled with half-truths and contradictions. Tyrone claimed he had nothing to do with the disappearance, that Vanessa was pulling the strings, that he was just the fall guy. But when asked why he was seen near the docks that morning, Tyrone's story fell apart. "I was meeting Vanessa," he said. "She told me to wait there. Said she had something for me." Detectives weren't buying it. Tyrone's alibi was weak and his involvement was clear, but was he the mastermind or was he covering for someone else? Back at the station, Detective Wiggins stared at the evidence board, his eyes tracing the lines connecting Vanessa, Darius, and Tyrone. 3 names, 3 stories, 3 versions of the truth. But somewhere in the middle, between the lies and the money and missing boat, the real story was waiting to be uncovered. And it was about to surface. Meanwhile, things were already taking another turn in their house. Darius was growing suspicious of Vanessa and her pregnancy. The night Vanessa told him she was pregnant, he'd felt a surge of guilt, a pang of regret. But as the weeks went on, as Vanessa's belly grew, something started gnawing at him, a nagging doubt that kept him up at night. The dates didn't add up. The timing felt wrong. Darius remembered the day Vanessa told him she was pregnant, the way she said it, the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. He remembered how she clutched his hand, how she said it was going to bring them closer, how she said it would make them a real family. But Darius started doing the math, counting back the days. And that's when it hit him. The baby wasn't his. Darius confronted Vanessa in the kitchen, his fists clenched, his jaw set. "Whose baby is it?" he demanded, his voice low, dangerous. Vanessa looked away, her eyes darting to the window, to the front door, to anywhere but Darius's face. "It's yours," she said, her voice shaking. "You know it's yours." But Darius wasn't buying it. "I saw you with Tyrone," he said, stepping closer, his breath hot against her face. "I saw you slipping out of his car. I saw you in the alley behind the bar." Vanessa swallowed hard, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. "It's yours," she repeated, her voice weaker now, less certain. Darius grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her skin. "You're lying," he said. "You've been lying to me since the beginning." Vanessa wrenched herself free, stumbling backward, her eyes wide. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice rising. "You're crazy." Darius shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "No," he said, stepping back, his eyes cold. "You are." The next day, Darius moved out of their shared home and filed for an annulment. This was just 3 months after their marriage. That same week, the police arrived at the house with a warrant in hand, the early morning light casting long shadows across the front lawn. The neighborhood was quiet, blinds drawn, eyes peering through slats as detectives moved through the front door. Detectives moved quickly. Rooms searched, drawers emptied, closets rifled through. They moved to the master bedroom, the guest room, the garage. In the corner of the guest room, one officer noticed a small wooden box shoved beneath the bed, half hidden beneath a pile of clothes. He pulled it out, lifted the lid, and found a notebook, its cover worn, the edges frayed. The name Vanessa was written in blue ink on the first page. Detective Wiggins took the notebook, his gloves squeaking against the pages as he flipped through it. The handwriting was neat, tight, almost obsessive. Page after page, Vanessa had poured out her secrets, her fantasies, her fears. It started with a confession. "I always loved him," she wrote, "from the moment he moved into town. I knew he was mine. But Hannah got to him first." Vanessa described their first kiss, the first time Darius slipped into her room while Hannah was out shopping, the first time he told her he loved her. She wrote about the lies they told Hannah, the excuses they made, the nights spent together while Hannah sat up alone, waiting for a husband who never came home. "It was supposed to be our secret," Vanessa wrote, "our forever." But then she found out. Hannah had confronted Vanessa with the texts. Vanessa claimed, called her a liar, a backstabber, a whore. Hannah said she was going to the church. She ways we was going to expose them, said she was going to tell everyone. Vanessa wrote that she and Darius had made a plan to quiet Hannah for life, take her insurance money, $750,000 for Hannah and $250,000 for Journey. Go to a new state and start life afresh. Deleted WhatsApp messages retrieved from her phone also show that she sent the following messages to Tyrone earlier on. "I told him to handle it, make it look like an accident. A storm. No body. No crime." Detectives had also uncovered Vanessa's insurance tampering under South Carolina Code Section 38-55-170. Tyrone, Darius, and Vanessa were all arrested. And then came the trials. The courthouse, a small building on the edge of town, was packed with reporters, families, and curious onlookers, all eager to see justice unfold. Vanessa and Darius were charged with conspiracy to commit double homicide, and Tyrone Mason was charged with 2 counts of murder. The charges alone sent shockwaves through the small town, but it was the trial itself that revealed the ugly truth behind the Brooks family's unraveling. In the courtroom, Darius sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes focused on the table in front of him. His defense team tried to paint him as a victim of Vanessa's manipulation, a man who had been deceived by his wife's sister, who had been led astray by lies and promises of a better life. They claimed Darius never intended for anyone to get hurt. He loved his family, they argued. He had nothing to do with the murders. But the prosecution's case was airtight. They presented the surveillance footage, showing Darius and Vanessa laughing and drinking just hours after the disappearance of Hannah and Journey. They showed the messages from Vanessa's phone, the ones where she spoke of handling it clean and making sure Tyrone took care of things. They revealed Darius' involvement in the financial transactions with Tyrone, the $20,000 that had been paid to him just days before the trip. They laid out the sequence of events that led to the disappearance of the Brooks family, and with each new piece of evidence, the picture became clearer. Darius had been involved, whether he liked it or not. Vanessa's trial was equally intense. Her defense tried to argue that she had been manipulated by Tyrone, that she had been trapped in a relationship with a man who had control over her. They claimed Vanessa never meant for things to go this far, that she never intended for Hannah and Journey to die. But the prosecution was not buying it. They painted her as the mastermind, the one who pulled the strings from behind the scenes, the one who used her own sister to further her own desires. They presented the diary, the one Vanessa had kept, filled with details of her affair with Darius, her plans to eliminate Hannah, and her betrayal of her own flesh and blood. Vanessa's face was unreadable throughout the trial. She never seemed to show remorse, never seemed to truly grasp the magnitude of what she had done. Tyrone's trial was the most brutal. He had no defense. His confession, though filled with contradictions, was enough to seal his fate. Tyrone admitted to following the Brooks boat that morning, to disabling the engine, and to dumping the bodies at sea. He had been promised money, a large sum, and he had been told that once the job was done, he could disappear, free of any responsibility. His motivation was simple greed. Tyrone didn't care about Darius or Vanessa, he cared about the payout. And when the storm hit, he saw his opportunity. The prosecution showed his history of illegal activities, his ties to the criminal underworld, and the fact that he had been paid handsomely for his role in the murders. It was clear that Tyrone wasn't just a pawn in a twisted game, he was an active participant, a willing accomplice who had played his part in the murders with chilling precision. The emotional statements from Hannah's family members added a heavy weight to the courtroom. Hannah's parents, sitting in the front row, their eyes red from crying, spoke of their daughter's kindness, her love for her family, and how she had always dreamed of giving Journey a better life. They spoke of the pain of losing her, of not knowing what had really happened, and of the betrayal they felt when they learned of the role Vanessa had played in their daughter's death. Journey's aunt, Hannah's sister, spoke of the child's bright spirit, of how she had been robbed of a future, of how she would never see her niece's laughter again. The room was heavy with grief, the weight of the loss felt by everyone who had known the Brooks family. The sentencing was swift, but it didn't bring closure. Darius was sentenced to life in prison, his plea for leniency rejected by the judge. Vanessa was given a similar sentence, though her lack of emotion throughout the trial led many to question whether she truly understood the severity of what she had done. Tyrone was sentenced to death, his actions deemed unforgivable by the court. While in prison, a DNA test was conducted, and it was confirmed that the baby is actually for Tyrone. But what kind of life will the child grow up to? What will he be told about his parents? Mariner's Bluff would never be the same. The town had lost more than just 2 lives. It had lost its sense of trust, its sense of safety, and its faith in the people it had once held dear. The shockwaves of the murders reverberated through the community, and though time would eventually heal the wounds, the scars would remain forever. For the people of Mariner's Bluff, justice had been served, but at what cost? In a web of lies, sometimes the most convincing storytellers are the ones who believe their own deceptions. Vanessa had spun a story for herself, a story in which she was not just a victim of circumstance, but a woman who took control of her fate, no matter the cost. To her, Darius wasn't just a man caught in her web, he was a partner, a willing participant in her plans. She convinced herself that she was doing the right thing, that taking out her sister and her niece was the only way to secure a future for herself, to get everything she had ever wanted, and Darius, so consumed by his own insecurities and guilt, bought into that story, allowing himself to believe the lies she fed him, the story that made him think he was the victim in all of this. They both built a world around them where the truth was a distant concept, one that they manipulated to fit their desires. But the problem with living in a lie is that eventually reality has a way of breaking through. Darius may have believed that the affair with his wife's sister was justified, that the lies Vanessa had crafted were simply part of the game they played. But when the storm hit, when the boat went under, and when their plans finally unraveled, the truth could no longer be ignored. In the end, it wasn't just the betrayal of a spouse or a sibling that destroyed them, it was the betrayal of their own selves. The moment Darius realized the baby wasn't his, the realization shattered the fragile world they had built. The guilt of knowing what they had done, to Hannah, to Journey, to themselves, consumed him. For Tyrone, the man who had carried out the physical act of killing, there was no escaping the reality of his own actions. His claim that Vanessa masterminded everything fell on deaf ears. He might have believed that he was simply a pawn in a much larger game, but his role in the deaths of 2 innocent people could not be overlooked. Tyrone had his own demons, his own life full of crime and desperation, but the moment he agreed to follow through with Vanessa's plan, he crossed a line that could never be undone, and when the time came to answer for his actions, there was no turning back, no amount of regret, no amount of pleading could change what he had done. He had played his part, but ultimately, it was the lives of Hannah and Journey that paid the price. In the end, this wasn't just a story about murder. It was a story about the darkness that can fester behind the smiles and promises we make to the ones we love. about how easily we can deceive ourselves into thinking that our lies won't catch up to us. It was a cautionary tale about trust, about betrayal, and about the dark side of family loyalty. It was a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who can hurt us the most, and that the truth, no matter how hard it is to face, will always find a way to break free from the webs we weave. Story 2. On November 16, 2017, tragedy struck a quiet Georgia neighborhood. George, a decorated military officer, was gunned down just outside his home. Inside, his family slept peacefully, unaware of the nightmare unfolding. But as investigators began to search for answers, one chilling truth emerged. George's greatest enemy wasn't someone from his past, but someone far closer. Someone who wore the mask of a grieving wife. The fire, which had ravaged the house in the dead of night, left behind nothing but ashes. The structure of the home was nearly unrecognizable, reduced to smoldering ruins. The heat from the blaze had been intense, and the smoke had lingered long after the flames had been extinguished, thick and acrid in the cold morning air. Among the debris, 2 bodies were found, burned beyond recognition. The identity of the victims was unclear at first, their faces and features destroyed by the intensity of the fire. But after a careful investigation, the bodies were identified. They were the children of George and Celine, their young son, Nicholas, and daughter, Nicole. Both were just 5 years old. The authorities were baffled. How had the fire started? Was it an accident? A faulty wire? Or something more sinister? The cause of the fire remained a mystery. No one knew exactly what had happened in that house, and the questions only multiplied as the investigation began. Was it just a tragic accident, or had something darker been at play? There was one glaring question that lingered over everything. Where was Elena? Elena, the 20-year-old foster daughter of George and Celine, had been living in the home for years. She was the only other person expected to be there that night, but she was nowhere to be found. She had been seen earlier that evening, but when the fire broke out, Elena was absent from the scene. The investigators couldn't account for her whereabouts, adding another layer of suspicion to growing mystery. Elena's absence was peculiar. Why was she not home when the fire erupted? Was it simply a coincidence that she had been absent, or was there more to her disappearance? Was she involved in some way? These were questions that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Elena had been a steady presence in the household, and no one expected her to be away during such a critical time. The fire, with its rapid spread and intensity, made it nearly impossible to determine exactly how it started or why it had spread so quickly. No one could say for sure what had happened that night. Theories were tossed around, but none provided any clear answers. The tragic loss of George and Celine's children left the community reeling, and the investigation into the fire only seemed to bring up more questions than answers. What caused the fire? Was it just a devastating accident, or had someone been responsible for starting it? And why were the children left inside? The cause of the fire remained a mystery, and the deaths of Nicholas and Nicole would haunt everyone who knew them. The most mysterious thing about the case is that 1 week ago, precisely the 9th of November, 2017, George had been found dead. He was shot brutally in his home while the kids were asleep. The community, already reeling from George's death, now had to contend with the tragic loss of 2 innocent children, their lives taken in the cruelest way imaginable. But as the days stretched on, one burning question remained unanswered. Was this a fire or was it a message? It was then that a familiar car pulled into the driveway. The engine idled for a moment, then the door opened and Elena stepped out. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and confused as she took in the scene before her. The house was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton of what it once was. Smoke still lingered in the air, swirling around the charred remains of the structure. Firefighters hosed down the last embers, the water mixing with the ashes to form muddy pools on the ground. Elena took a shaky step forward, her expression dazed. "What happened?" she asked, her voice thin and quivering. "Where are Nicholas and Nicole? Where's my family?" Detective Samuels, who had been standing near the wreckage, turned to face her. His gaze was sharp, his jaw clenched. "Elena," he said, his voice heavy. "Where have you been?" Elena swallowed, her eyes darting from the house to the detective. "I went for a drive," she stammered. "I couldn't sleep. I just needed to clear my head." Samuels arched an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing. "A drive?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Yes," Elena said, her voice growing more defensive. "I was driving around. I didn't know this was happening." And where did you go? Samuels pressed, his gaze fixed on her. Elena's eyes flicked away, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Just around, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't go anywhere specific, I just needed to clear my mind. The detective's jaw tightened. So let me get this straight, he said, his tone cool and even. You couldn't sleep, so you went for a drive. While you were driving around aimlessly, your house caught fire and your 2 siblings were trapped inside. Is that what you're saying? Elena swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with tears. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know. I would never have left them if I knew this would happen. Samuels nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. What time did you leave the house, Elena? I don't remember, she said, her voice growing more frantic. It was late, maybe 2. Elena, he said, his voice a low measured whisper. Did you leave the house because you knew the fire was going to happen? Did you leave because you knew what was coming? Elena's head shot up, her eyes wide with terror. No, she screamed, her face wet with tears. I would never do that. I would never hurt them. Samuels studied her for a long, tense moment. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, and the echo of the fire truck still lingered in the distance. The detective rose to his feet, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. George was a man who had built his life on discipline, honor, and a sense of duty that never wavered. As a decorated military veteran, he was a man revered in Beaufort, Georgia, a man whose reputation for kindness and integrity was known to everyone in the community. People spoke of him as a devoted husband, a loving father, a man who would drop everything to help a neighbor in need. But behind the stoic exterior was a man whose life was slowly unraveling, and the very people closest to him would soon become the catalyst for a tragedy that no one could have predicted. At home, George's life was anything but peaceful. His marriage to Celine, the woman who had stood by his side for years, was quietly crumbling. Celine was a devoted wife, a mother whose life revolved around her children and the stability of her family. She was the kind of woman who never missed a school event, who packed her children's lunches with care, and who stayed up late waiting for George to come home, even when the distance between them grew more profound with each passing day. The tension in the house was palpable, but no one spoke of it. George became increasingly withdrawn, his gaze distant, his smile forced. Celine felt it too. The man who once held her close now seemed like a stranger, his attention focused elsewhere. But where and why? The answer to that question stood right in front of them every single day. Elena. Elena had been adopted by George and Celine when she was just 10 years old. Back then she was a timid, wide-eyed child, eager to please, desperate for love and affection. But as the years passed, Elena grew into something else entirely. By the time she turned 20, she was no longer the shy little girl who had once clung to Celine's side. She had blossomed into a striking young woman with curves that drew eyes and a charm that masked her true intentions. In the privacy of the home, Elena's behavior began to change. She started wearing clothes that were tight, revealing and far too provocative for a young woman living under her adoptive father's roof. She moved around the house with a newfound confidence, her presence impossible to ignore. At first, Celine dismissed it as a phase, a young woman seeking attention. But soon, the signs became impossible to ignore. Elena's interactions with George grew more intimate, more unsettling. She lingered too long when she hugged him. She leaned too close when she spoke. Her touches became more calculated, her eyes more intense. George, already vulnerable from the strain of his crumbling marriage, found himself drawn to her in ways that he knew were wrong, but in ways he could not seem to resist. Celine watched as her husband drifted further away, his conversations with Elena growing longer, his interactions with Celine growing colder. Celine confronted George about it, but he dismissed her concerns, calling her paranoid, saying she was imagining things. Celine felt herself becoming invisible in her own home, her presence diminished by the growing bond between her husband and the girl she had once called daughter. Then came the night of the accident. Celine had been driving home from the grocery store, the road slick from a recent rainstorm. She was only a mile away from home when her car's brakes failed. The vehicle veered off the road, slamming into a tree with deadly force. Celine was pronounced dead at the scene. The police ruled it an accident, a tragic mechanical failure. But those who knew Celine questioned how a woman so cautious, so attentive, could have lost control of her car in such a horrific manner. In the days that followed, George was a broken man. His wife was dead, and the guilt consumed him. But while he grieved, Elena moved in closer. She was the first to console him, the first to wrap her arms around him, and tell him that she was there for him, that she would always be there for him. In those moments, Elena became more than just a daughter. She became George's confidant, his solace, his comfort. George was drowning in grief, and Elena was his lifeline. And she knew it. Days turned into weeks, and Elena's presence became more pronounced. She took over Celine's role in the household, cooking meals, organizing the house, comforting George in ways that felt disturbingly intimate. The line between father and daughter blurred, and soon, there was no line at all. George was weak, vulnerable, and easily manipulated. Elena knew this, and she exploited it. She whispered to him that she loved him, that she was the only one who truly understood him. She convinced him that they were meant to be together, that Celine's death was fate's way of bringing them closer. George, desperate for affection and blinded by his grief, allowed himself to believe her. He remarried her. Meanwhile, Nicholas and Nicole, the young children of the household, watched as their home became a place they no longer recognized. The woman who had once been their sister was now playing the role of their mother, her hold over George tightening with each passing day. 1 week before the fire, George was found dead, shot multiple times at close range. His blood pooled around him, staining the carpet beneath his body. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic scent of blood. When the police arrived at the scene, the house was eerily silent except for the soft, choked sobs of a woman who seemed to be caught between hysteria and shock. It was Elena. Elena stood in the center of the living room, her hands shaking, her eyes wide with what appeared to be terror. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair matted against her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched a handkerchief, pressing it to her mouth as though to stifle her cries. "He was shot," she said, her voice trembling. "I was in my room. I heard the gunshots. I ran out, and I saw him lying there. There was a man. He was running out the back door. I couldn't see his face. It was too dark." The funeral was held 3 days later. The small chapel was packed with friends, neighbors, and former military colleagues who had come to pay their respects to a man they had once admired and respected. The air was heavy with the scent of white lilies, their fragrance almost suffocating in the closed space. Elena sat in the front row, dressed in a simple black dress, a veil pulled low over her face. Her hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled tissue, her sobs echoing softly through the room. When the priest spoke of George's service, of his courage and honor, Elena's shoulders shook violently, her cries growing louder. When the casket was carried down the aisle, she nearly collapsed, reaching out as though she couldn't bear to let go. "He was my husband," she wailed, her voice cracking. "I loved him so much." The mourners wept along with her, some dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They watched as Elena fell to her knees beside the casket, pressing her forehead against the polished wood, her sobs raw and guttural. But behind that veil, behind those perfectly timed tears, there was something else, something darker. Elena clung to the casket as though she couldn't bear to part with it. But those who watched closely saw her eyes flicker, saw the quick she was watching, observing and calculating. When the service ended, Elena was the last to leave. She lingered by the grave, her hands clasped in front of her. The tears had dried now, and her face was a blank mask. As the others made their way to their cars, Elena stood alone, staring at the mound of freshly turned earth. A continuous pattern of tragedy was not a coincidence, and Detective Samuels set his mind to get to the bottom of this case. His guts knew something was wrong and all fingers pointed towards Elena, but he needed to get evidence. He started his investigation in a subtle manner. The detectives began by reconstructing the night of George's death. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras was pulled, meticulously reviewed frame by frame. At 11:47 p.m., George's vehicle was seen pulling into the driveway. He stepped out, his shoulders slumped, his movements slow and heavy. He unlocked the front door and entered the house. This was the last time anyone outside the home saw George alive. Approximately 30 minutes later, a shadowy figure was seen exiting through the back door. The figure moved swiftly, head down, face obscured by the darkness. The footage was grainy, the quality poor, but the figure's height and build bore a striking resemblance to Elena. The timestamp read 12:21 a.m., just 21 minutes after George had been shot multiple times. The detectives replayed the urgency in the figure's steps, the way they clutched a dark object close to their body before disappearing into the night. But the footage alone was not enough. It was too blurry, too inconclusive. Investigators questioned Elena, asking her where she was during those crucial minutes. Elena claimed she had been in her room, lying in bed, unable to sleep. She said she heard the gunshots, but was too frightened to come out until hours later, when she found George lying in a pool of his own blood. But the timeline didn't add up. Elena had been in her room, she said, yet the surveillance footage clearly showed her leaving the house just before George arrived home. When confronted with this discrepancy, Elena's demeanor shifted, her eyes grew cold, her posture tense. "I must have forgotten," she said, her voice clipped. It was all a blur. But the inconsistencies didn't end there. Phone records revealed that Elena had made several calls in the early hours of that night, just minutes after the time of George's death. The number she dialed was traced to Logan Hayes, a man with a violent criminal record and a history of theft. Logan had been recently released from prison, and his name had surfaced in connection with several armed robberies in the area. Text messages exchanged between Elena and Logan painted a disturbing picture. The messages spanned several weeks leading up to George's death. They were brief, hurried, and laced with desperation. Elena complained about feeling trapped, about needing money, about wanting to leave town. But the most chilling message was sent just hours before George was shot. Elena texted Logan, "It has to be tonight. No more waiting." The detectives continued to dig deeper, searching for anything that could further implicate Elena. They obtained a search warrant to search her room, hoping to find evidence that would link her to the murder: a gun, bloody clothes, a plan written down somewhere. But the house was now nothing more than a pile of smoldering rubble. The fire had been ruthless, consuming everything in its path. Elena's room was completely destroyed. The walls were blackened, the floors reduced to ash, the furniture nothing but twisted metal and charred wood. Any evidence that might have been hidden there was now gone. Fire investigators concluded that the fire had started in the children's room, but the exact cause remained a mystery. There were no obvious signs of accelerants, but the speed and intensity of the fire suggested it had been deliberately set. The fire had spread rapidly, engulfing the entire structure in minutes. By the time the fire department arrived, there was little left to salvage. Elena's explanation for that night was as vague as her alibi on the night of George's death. She claimed she couldn't sleep and had gone for a drive to clear her head. But there were no witnesses to confirm her story, and surveillance footage showed her car pulling away from the house at 2:14 a.m., just moments before the fire erupted. The car did not return until the fire trucks were already on the scene. When questioned about where she had gone, Elena said she just drove around, aimlessly, lost in her thoughts. The detectives pressed her. "Why did you leave the house so late? Why were you gone for hours?" Elena's responses were clipped, her tone defensive. "I needed space," she said. "I couldn't be there. Not after everything that happened." But the detectives were not convinced. They had seen grief before. They had seen true devastation. And what they saw in Elena was not the anguish of a woman who had lost her family. What they saw was calculation, control, and the absence of any genuine emotion. Meanwhile, the autopsy report on George's body revealed more unsettling details. He had been shot 5 times, each bullet placed with precision in vital areas. The pattern of the shots suggested a calm, calculated attack. This was not a chaotic, spur-of-the-moment robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. Despite the mounting evidence, there was still no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no concrete evidence linking Elena to the fire or the murder. The detectives felt the pressure mounting. Detective Samuels, the lead investigator, grew increasingly uneasy. He reviewed the footage again, studying the shadowy figure leaving through the back door. He watched Elena's car pull away at 2:14 a.m., disappearing into the night. He read the text messages, the diary entries, the insurance policy that named Elena as the sole beneficiary. He thought of the surveillance footage, the discrepancies in her timeline, the lack of emotion in her eyes when she spoke of her father and her siblings. Samuels was convinced they were missing something, a crucial piece of evidence that tied Elena to the crimes, something that would explain how a father ended up dead, how 2 innocent children were left to die in a fire, how Elena emerged unscathed, with nothing but a rehearsed story and eyes that betrayed nothing. But with the house destroyed, any evidence that might have been hidden there was gone forever. The fire had consumed it all, erasing every trace, every clue, every secret. The detectives were left with nothing but Elena's story and the haunting feeling that beneath her calm exterior, there was a truth waiting to be uncovered, a truth that could shatter everything. And as the investigation continued, everyone had a theory, but the truth remained as elusive as ever. Was George's murder a random act of violence, or was it deeply personal? The brutality of the attack suggested rage. George was shot 5 times, each bullet placed with precision in vital areas of his body. This was not the work of a petty thief. Whoever pulled the trigger had wanted George dead and had ensured that he would not survive. Yet, nothing was stolen. The house had not been ransacked, no valuables were missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. George had let his killer in, suggesting he knew them. Some speculated that George's military background could have played a role. He had served in several high-profile operations, some of which involved sensitive intelligence. Had someone from his past resurfaced, seeking revenge? Or was there something darker at play, something closer to home? Others focused on the timing of Celine's death. Months before George was gunned down, Celine had died in what was initially ruled a tragic car accident. Celine was driving home late at night when her brakes failed, causing her car to veer off the road and slam into a tree. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation into her death was brief, with authorities attributing the crash to a mechanical failure. But now, with George dead and the children killed in a fire, the circumstances surrounding Celine's death were being re-examined with a more critical eye. Was Celine's accident truly an accident? Or had it been the first strike in a calculated plot? Investigators began to dig into the car's maintenance records, searching for any indication of tampering. The brake lines had been damaged, but whether it was the result of negligence or deliberate sabotage remained unclear. Celine's car had been serviced just 2 weeks before the crash. The mechanic who worked on the car insisted that the brakes had been in perfect working order, but the mechanic was a friend of Elena's. How well did he know her, and what else had he seen? The detectives considered the possibility that Celine had been the first victim. Perhaps she had discovered something she wasn't supposed to, something involving Elena. The relationship between Celine and Elena had been strained in months leading up to Celine's death. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments, raised voices, accusations of betrayal. Was Celine onto something? Had she seen the beginnings of a plan that involved her husband and children? Had she confronted Elena only to pay the ultimate price? But if Celine was the first victim, did that mean George was the second? And if so, was Elena truly the mastermind behind both deaths? Or was there someone else, someone pulling the strings from the shadows? Investigators looked into Elena's background. Elena was adopted at the age of 10, a young girl taken in by George and Celine after a troubled childhood. On paper, she was the grieving daughter, the only surviving member of a once happy family. But as they dug deeper, they discovered that Elena had recently reconnected with someone from her past. Logan Hayes, a man with a criminal record, a history of theft, and a violent temper. Logan and Elena had exchanged dozens of text messages in the weeks leading up to George's murder. The messages were cryptic, but one stood out: "It has to be tonight. No more waiting." Could Logan have been the one who pulled the trigger? Was he the figure seen fleeing the house on the night George was killed? And if so, was he acting alone? Or was Elena the one orchestrating everything from behind the scenes? Meanwhile, the detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Elena herself was being manipulated. Logan was known for being aggressive, controlling, and dangerous. Could he have pressured Elena into participating in the crimes? Was she a victim or a willing accomplice? And what about the life insurance policy? A $100,000 payout was set to be collected by Elena following George's death. It was a sizable sum, one that could set Elena and Logan up for life. As the detectives tried to connect the dots, false leads began to emerge. The public was in a frenzy, desperate for answers. Theories spread like wildfire, each more sensational than the last. One neighbor claimed to have seen a man lurking around George's house the night he was killed, but when questioned, the neighbor's story fell apart. His description of the man was vague, inconsistent, and contradicted by surveillance footage that showed no such person in the area. Then there was George's longtime friend, Tim Pearson. Tim had been a close confidant of George, a fellow veteran who had been there for George during some of his darkest moments. In the days following George's murder, Tim appeared overly interested in the life insurance payout. He asked questions about who would inherit the money, whether the policy had been finalized, and how soon the funds would be released. Detectives brought Tim in for questioning. His alibi was solid, but his obsession with the insurance money raised suspicions. Was Tim simply concerned for Elena, or was he hoping to get a cut of the payout? Had he pressured Elena into plotting the murder, or was he a red herring, a man whose only crime was being overly curious? And then there was the mysterious car. On the night of Celine's crash, a witness had reported seeing a dark sedan parked along the roadside, just a few hundred yards from the site of the accident. The car had been idling, its headlights off, as if waiting for someone. By the time the paramedics arrived, the car was gone. The detectives tracked down the witness, a truck driver who was passing through at the time. He recalled seeing a man in the driver's seat, smoking a cigarette, his face obscured by shadows. When asked to describe the man, the witness said he couldn't remember anything distinct, just that he seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Investigators searched for the car, but the lead went cold. The license plate was untraceable, the vehicle never found. Was the car connected to Celine's death? Was it a coincidence or part of a larger plan? And if it was Logan's car, did that mean he was involved in Celine's death as well? As the investigation pressed on, the detectives found themselves drowning in a sea of conflicting evidence, unanswered questions, and theories that seemed to twist and turn with every new revelation. Detective Samuels was a man who had seen his share of crime scenes, but as he stood outside Logan Hayes' house, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind that whipped through the neighborhood. The case had taken a dark turn, and Samuels could feel it in his gut. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and the picture they formed was one of ruthless calculation and cold-blooded murder. Samuels and his team stormed Logan's house, armed with a warrant and a determination to uncover the truth. Logan, a man with a history of violence and a desperate need for money, had been under surveillance since the night of the fire. He was Elena's connection to a world of crime and deception, a man she had used as both an accomplice and a pawn. The house was a mess, dirty clothes strewn across the floor, empty beer cans stacked haphazardly, cigarette butts ground into the carpet. Logan sat on the couch, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking as Samuels confronted him. The search began, and it didn't take long for them to find what they were looking for. In a drawer in the bedroom, buried beneath old clothes and crumpled bills, they found the burner phone. It was cheap, disposable, and its battery was almost dead, but when they powered it on, the evidence was damning. The phone was packed with text messages, hundreds of them, all between Logan and Elena. The messages told a story that no one had expected, a story of manipulation, greed, and murder. Samuels and his team scrolled through the messages, each one more disturbing than the last. There were texts from months ago, messages that detailed Elena's growing frustration with her life, her desire for control, her plans to eliminate anyone who stood in her way. The first messages focused on Celine. Elena had seen her as an obstacle, a woman who held George's love, a woman who stood between her and the military benefits she desperately wanted. In the texts, Elena explained how she had manipulated George into tampering with Celine's brakes. "I told him she was cheating," one message read. "I told him she was going to leave and take everything. He believed me. He always believed me." Another text was more explicit. "Make sure the brakes are loose, not enough to kill her outright, just enough to scare her. We can finish the job later." Samuels felt his stomach turn as he read the messages. Celine's death had been ruled an accident, a tragic mechanical failure, but now it was clear that it had been the first step in Elena's twisted plan. Celine had to go not just to clear the way for Elena, but to begin the process of isolating George, making him more vulnerable, more dependent on her. The messages continued, each one more damning than the last. Elena had planned every detail of George's death, and she had used Logan to carry it out. The texts were precise, almost clinical in their execution. Elena's words were cold, detached, devoid of emotion. "Tonight's the night," one message read. "I've already given him the sedative. He won't fight back. Come in through the back door. I'll leave it unlocked." Samuels clenched his jaw as he read the next line. "Shoot him twice in the chest, once in the head. Make it quick, make it clean, and then get out. I'll handle the rest." The text painted a picture of a woman who had manipulated George into a false sense of security, only to drug him and set him up for a murder that she had orchestrated from start to finish. George, a man who had survived war zones and combat missions, had been betrayed by the very woman he had taken in as a daughter. But Elena wasn't finished. The messages revealed that her plan extended far beyond George. The fire that killed Nicholas and Nicole was not an accident. It was the final act in a deadly scheme that Elena had meticulously crafted. Elena had written, "The kids have to go too, no witnesses, no claims, just me and you." Samuel stared at the phone, his mind racing as he pieced together the sequence of events. Elena had seduced Logan, convinced him that he would be free of debt, that they would have a new life together. She promised him a share of the life insurance money, enough to pay off his creditors and set up a business for them both. But there was a catch. In order to collect the money, Everyone had to be out of the picture. George was the first target, Celine was the second, the children were the final step. The fire had been deliberate, a calculated move to eliminate any remaining heirs to the military benefits. Elena knew that as long as the children were alive, they could claim George's benefits, money she wanted all for herself, and Logan was the tool she had used to carry it out. Samuels closed his eyes, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. He had seen greed drive people to do terrible things, but this was different. This was a woman who had planned the systematic destruction of her entire family, all for money and control. But now the game was over. The burner phone was the smoking gun, the undeniable link that connected Elena to every crime. And as Samuels stormed out of Logan's house, barking orders to his team to put out a statewide alert, one thought echoed through his mind. Elena was out there somewhere, and if they didn't catch her soon, she would disappear with the money, leaving behind nothing but ashes, lies, and the haunting memory of a family she had destroyed. They arrested her and Logan immediately. They were both charged to court for trial. The trial of Elena Porter and Logan Hayes became a spectacle that captivated the nation. The courtroom was filled to capacity every day. Reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing as the two defendants were let inside in handcuffs. Elena Porter, the woman who had once portrayed herself as a grieving daughter, now sat beside Logan Hayes, her alleged co-conspirator. The two of them, once partners in a deadly scheme, now found themselves facing life behind bars for the murders of George Porter, Celine Porter, and the children, Nicholas and Nicole. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting the mountain of evidence that had been uncovered in Logan's home. The burner phone, the incriminating text messages, the chilling call recordings, they were all laid out in painstaking detail, piece by piece, constructing a timeline that revealed a plan months in the making. The prosecutor began by establishing the motive. He held up the life insurance policy, a $100,000 payout that Elena would have collected upon the deaths of George and his children. This was the motive, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. Money, power, control. Elena Porter didn't just want the money, she wanted the life that came with it, a life free of the family that she saw as obstacles standing in her way. The prosecutor moved to the evidence recovered from Logan's home. The burner phone was displayed for the jury, a device packed with damning messages. Messages in which Elena detailed her plan, step by step. Messages in which she manipulated Logan, playing on his desperation, his debt, his misguided love for her. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts for both defendants. Elena Porter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her expression blank as the judge delivered the sentence. Logan Hayes, whose cooperation and testimony were taken into account, was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. And as the prison doors slammed shut behind Elena Porter and Logan Hayes, the world outside moved on. But the memories of those lost, the father who trusted the wrong woman, the children who never had a chance, the mother who never saw it coming, remained frozen in time. A haunting reminder of just how far some people are willing to go to get what they want. But what drives someone to orchestrate such calculated destruction against their own family? Was it greed? Was it power? Or was it a chilling combination of both? Today, we've peeled back the layers of a web of lies and deceit that tore a family apart, revealing the lengths to which some will go to secure a life of luxury built on the ashes of those they claim to love. But there are still questions left unanswered. How did a once loving daughter transform into a ruthless manipulator? What signs were missed? And could these horrific crimes have been prevented? If you or someone you know is facing manipulation, coercion, or violence, speak up. The signs may not always be obvious, but they're there. Trust your instincts. Ask questions. Reach out to someone you trust. Because in the end, it's not just about seeking justice for the victims. It's about preventing the next tragedy before it happens. Stay vigilant. Stay informed. And remember, sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Story 3. He pushed his son down a cliff. But before that moment, Jerome found something that would change everything. A diary, hidden in his son Aiden's room on July 21st, 2022. Inside were names, dates, and chilling details. Aiden wasn't just venting, he had a plan. A list of people he wanted to hurt. Methods. Places. Revenge. The journal didn't just reveal secrets, it revealed something far darker. And Jerome had no idea how far his son had gone, or what it would cost him to find out. Jerome, the father, stands frozen, his body tense. His mind is weighed down by a secret so heavy he can barely carry it. This secret has led him to this moment, standing on the edge of something he can't take back. He watches his son, the boy he once held in his arms, the child he promised to protect. But now, as he stands on the edge of this cliff, his love for Aiden feels distant, tangled with fear. A father's love? Or a father's curse? A son's fate? Or a father's nightmare? These words echo in his mind, too loud to ignore, as though they weren't meant to be answered, just to haunt him. The wind picks up, making the trees rustle louder, breaking the silence around them. Jerome's hesitation grows. He steps forward slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. His feet feel heavy, like the earth itself is trying to hold him back. The choice hangs in the air like a thick fog, clouding his thoughts. He looks at Aiden, his mind flashing back to the days when his son laughed in his arms, innocent and full of joy. Those days feel so far away now, like they belong to another person. But now, as Jerome steps closer to Aiden, something inside him stops him. He pauses, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. He sees Aiden, so young, so vulnerable, and it freezes him. The fight inside him is too much to bear. Is this really the moment when a father's love turns into something dark? When protection turns into harm? Can he really do this? Aiden turns around, sensing something in the air. Their eyes meet, and in that moment, Jerome sees the confusion in his son's eyes. Aiden doesn't understand what's happening. He doesn't know the battle his father is facing. But Jerome knows. He knows that this is the moment that will change everything. This is the moment when a father has to choose. Will he protect his son or destroy him? But Jerome hesitates. The hand that was once steady now shakes. His feet refuse to move. In that quiet moment, the weight of what he's about to do presses down on him. He sees Aiden, the boy he raised, the boy he loves, and for just a moment, everything slows down. This decision is no longer about saving his family. It's about this one moment, standing there with his son, looking at the child he promised to protect. Jerome Carter, a man in his late 40s, was the kind of man you'd pass on the street and never give a second thought. Quiet, reserved, with a gentle demeanor that made him seem like just another husband, just another father. He had a wife, Tiffany, who loved him dearly, a woman whose warmth and support balanced his more distant nature. On the surface, their life seemed normal. A small house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of life most people would envy. But beneath the surface, something was breaking. Something neither of them fully understood. Jerome had always been the provider, the protector. It was in his nature. He was the kind of man who held his family together, even when things weren't easy. But over time, something had changed. The protective instincts that once defined him now felt suffocating. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man overwhelmed by fear. Fear that his own son, the child he loved more than anything, might be dangerous. The thought gnawed at him every day. Was his son a threat? Was he the one who needed protecting? Aiden, Jerome's 14-year-old son, had always been an enigma. He was quiet, withdrawn, and different from the other kids. While most children his age were carefree and full of energy, Aiden spent long hours alone, either staring at a computer screen or lost in his own thoughts. He never spoke much about what was going on in his head, and his parents could never quite place the intensity in his eyes. There was something about him that felt off, something that didn't fit with the normal image of a teenager. And the bullying. It started small but grew over time. At first, it was just whispers in the hallways, then snickers behind his back. There were moments, flashes of his childhood, when it seemed like everything could be different. A family vacation. A day in the park. Jerome and Aiden, side by side, laughing together. A time when the bond between father and son felt unbreakable. Back then, everything felt simple. Pure. But those days seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a son who no longer laughed, no longer trusted, and a father who couldn't understand why. On the 21st of July, 2022, one day, as Jerome was searching for his son's laptop charger, he found it. Hidden beneath a pile of old video games, a red leather-bound journal. He had no reason to suspect anything, no reason to think that this small book could shatter everything he knew about his son. But when Jerome opened the pages, his heart sank. As he flipped through the journal, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It wasn't just the scribbled thoughts of a teenager. It was a list of names. His son had been keeping track of his classmates. And it wasn't just names. There were detailed descriptions, methods, dates, tools. Each page held a chilling vision of violence, a fantasy of revenge. The people who had tormented Aiden were all listed there, each one marked with a plan. Jerome's hands shook as he read through the pages. At first, it was disbelief. Then came the realization. His son wasn't just angry. He wasn't just upset. No, Aiden had been fantasizing about something far worse. Something that filled Jerome with a deep, paralyzing fear. This wasn't just a phase. This was something darker. And it was clear now. The boy he had tried to protect had become someone else entirely. Jerome sat in the dim light of their living room, the red, leather-bound journal lying heavy in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for Tiffany to read it. She was sitting across from him, eyes wide with disbelief as she flipped through the pages, her face growing paler with each new revelation. Every word in that journal seemed to pull the air from the room, suffocating them both. Tiffany's voice trembled as she asked, how could he? How could Aiden write this? The shock on her face mirrored Jerome's own. They didn't understand. They couldn't comprehend how their innocent son, the child they'd raised with so much love, could have written such horrific things. This wasn't some teenage rebellion or acting out. This was something darker, something much more disturbing. Jerome's thoughts were clouded with fear. He's not just angry, Tiffany, he said, his voice shaking with intensity. This is a plan. A kill list. His words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. He stared at the pages, his mind racing. Aiden is a threat. He's a psychopathic monster in the making. Tiffany shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. No, Jerome. He's not a monster. He's just a kid who's been hurt. We've failed him, but he doesn't need to be punished. He needs help. He needs therapy. He needs love. She reached out for his hand, but Jerome pulled away, unable to accept her comforting words. Jerome's eyes were hard as he looked at her. Love isn't going to fix this. He's already planning to kill people. He's already written out how it will happen. Do you want to wait until he actually does it? The tension between them was unbearable. Tiffany couldn't grasp the idea that her son, her baby boy, could be a danger to anyone. But Jerome couldn't see it any other way. He felt trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. In his mind, Aiden wasn't the victim. He was the ticking time bomb. And if Jerome didn't act, it could all come crashing down. The weight of his decision pressed down on him with every passing moment. The idea of protecting his family from his own flesh and blood tore at him. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. His son was capable of terrible things. The plan had already started. Jerome spent the night thinking, his hands shaking as he tried to steady himself. He paced back and forth, each step a march toward the inevitable. He knew what he had to do. He had already planned it, already set it in motion. The father-son hike was not what it seemed. Jerome wasn't taking Aiden to the mountains to reconnect. No, this was a one-way trip. A trip where there would be no return for Aiden. His plan was to push Aiden down when they get to the steepest part of the ridge. Jerome's mind swirled with thoughts of what was to come. But as he thought about the hike, memories of better days flooded his mind. He remembered Aiden as a child, so full of life. He remembered the laughter, the long days spent playing together. He remembered the way Aiden's small hand used to fit perfectly in his. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, like a dream that was slipping further away with each passing second. The pain was unbearable. The father in him longed to protect his son, to hold him close and tell him everything would be okay. But the fear in him, the fear of what Aiden might become, drove him forward. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man forced to make an unthinkable choice. Jerome and Aiden made their way up the Blue Ridge Mountains, the crunch of leaves underfoot and the rustling of the trees their only company. The sun was high in the sky, the day beautiful in its serenity. It seemed like any other hike, a father and son spending time together in nature. The air was crisp, the landscape vast and untouched. But there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of them could escape. Jerome tried to maintain a calm exterior. Even as his thoughts raced, his every step weighed down by the decision he had already made. Aiden, for his part, walked, his backpack bouncing lightly with each step, the sound of his shoes against the trail creating a rhythm. He didn't notice the look in his father's eyes, the unease that clung to Jerome's every movement. Jerome forced a smile, tried to keep the conversation light, asking Aiden about his school, his friends, anything to distract himself from the growing weight of what he was about to do. The quiet stretch of the path seemed to go on forever, but eventually they reached the steepest part of the trail. The drop on either side of them was sharp, the view breathtaking but terrifying. Jerome's heart pounded as he looked at the cliff ahead. This was the moment. He had planned it all. The right spot. The perfect opportunity. Go on ahead, Jerome said, his voice more strained than he intended. I'll catch up. Aiden didn't question it. He simply nodded, his gaze distant as he moved ahead along the trail. Jerome stood there for a moment, his body trembling, every muscle in him screaming to stop. But he took the first step forward, the weight of his decision crushing him with each movement. He could hear the distant sound of Aiden's footsteps, the space between them growing with every second. With every step, Jerome's heart thudded harder, his breath growing more shallow. This was it. His mind played out the scene 100 times. The push, the fall, the end, and then nothing. No more worry, no more fear. His family would be safe. He could protect Tiffany. He could protect them all. But then something inside him stopped. Jerome's feet froze, his body locked in place as his eyes landed on Aiden ahead of him. He could see his son now, walking with a slight bounce in his step, unaware of the storm that had been building in his father's chest. Jerome's breath hitched as memories flooded his mind. The first time he held Aiden in his arms, the baby's tiny hand gripping his finger. He remembered the way Aiden had smiled, the innocent joy in his eyes before the world had tainted him. He thought of the days when Aiden would run to him, his face lighting up with excitement, always seeking his approval, his protection. And now, here he was about to end it all. The weight of that thought nearly crushed him. He was a father, and yet here he was, poised to destroy the very thing he had vowed to protect. The guilt, the pain, the loss. It all hit him in that one frozen moment. His mind screamed to push, to end the nightmare. But his heart screamed louder. Aiden, sensing the shift, turned around. Their eyes met. It wasn't the confrontation Jerome had been expecting. There was no question, no fear, no anger. Instead, Aiden's gaze held confusion, almost a quiet understanding. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask why his father had stopped. Instead, he turned away, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. Jerome stood there, a cold sweat covering his skin. The world around him suddenly too loud, too real. Aiden didn't need to speak. His actions said it all. The silence between them was deafening. A thick wall that Jerome couldn't break through. Aiden knew. Then, in a flash, Jerome's mind went numb. His instincts took over. His hand shot out, and in one swift motion he shoved Aiden. The force of the push sent his son stumbling, flailing for balance. Aiden's body lurched forward, and for a terrifying second, he seemed to struggle against the inevitable pull of gravity. Time seemed to slow as Jerome watched his son topple over the edge. Aiden's eyes widened in shock, his arms reaching out in a desperate attempt to catch himself. But it was too late. One small push. That was all it took. In an instant, Aiden was falling, tumbling down the cliffside, his body disappearing into the abyss below. The next Monday, Jerome and Tiffany sat in their living room, the weight of the previous weekend still hanging heavy in the air. They hadn't spoken much about Aiden since the hike, but every moment felt thick with unspoken words and guilt. Their thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. It was Aiden's school counselor. Jerome answered, and the conversation was brief. The counselor's voice was calm but firm. "I'd like to meet with you both," she said, her tone carrying an urgency that immediately set alarm bells ringing in Jerome's mind. "Has something happened?" Tiffany asked, her voice tight with unease. There was a brief pause before the counselor spoke again. "I need to talk to you both in person. Please come by the school as soon as possible." Jerome hung up the phone, exchanging a look with Tiffany. Neither of them had expected this. They arrived at the school, their nerves frayed, unsure of what to expect. The counselor, a woman in her early 40s, greeted them warmly, but there was an unmistakable seriousness in her eyes. She led them into her office, where she sat them down with a comforting but unyielding look. "I'm afraid what I'm about to tell you is not easy to hear," she began, her voice steady but laden with empathy. "Aiden is a good kid." Jerome's chest tightened. He could feel the blood drain from his face. What could she possibly mean? He'd been so sure, so certain that Aiden was a threat to everyone around him. The counselor continued, her voice calm but direct. "Your son has been severely bullied for months. I've gathered disturbing footage from the school camera, showing the true horror he's endured." Tiffany and Jerome exchanged confused glances, the reality of what was being said sinking in slowly. The counselor clicked a button, and the footage began to play on the small screen in front of them. The images were hard to watch. The first clip showed Aiden in a dimly lit locker room. He was being choked by Thomas Parker, his body writhing as he struggled to breathe. The footage was shaky, but the pain was clear in Aiden's eyes. Tiffany's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The next clip was just as difficult. Tiffany Myers, one of Aiden's classmates, spitting directly into his face in the school cafeteria. She stood there laughing, as Aiden wiped his face in humiliation. The last clip was the hardest to watch. Malik Dawson, another classmate, dragging Aiden into the school bathroom. With cruel laughter, he shoved Aiden's head into the toilet and flushed it, his body trembling in the humiliation. Jerome's hands clenched into fists, the guilt gnawing at his insides. The evidence was undeniable. This was the reality Aiden had been living with. The counselor paused the footage and turned to look at them, her expression filled with compassion but also sorrow. These were not just isolated incidents, Jerome. This went on for months, and Aiden never spoke about it. He didn't want to show how much he was hurting. Jerome felt a wave of nausea hit him. The kill list, the journal, everything he had seen as a threat was now a desperate cry for help. The names on the list were not the victims, they were Aiden's tormentors. Jerome's mind reeled as he processed the truth. The pain he had caused, the decision he had made in a moment of fear, all of it felt unbearable now. Aiden hadn't been plotting murder, he had been fantasizing about revenge. He wanted to feel powerful in a world where he had been crushed under the weight of bullying and neglect. Aiden was a victim, and in their attempt to protect themselves from a fear they had misunderstood, they had destroyed the one person who needed their help the most. Tiffany's eyes filled with tears as she reached for Jerome's hand. "We failed him," she whispered, her voice breaking with sorrow. Jerome could only nod, the weight of their mistake too heavy to bear. The counselor's words echoed in their minds as they left the school. They had thought they were protecting their family, they had thought they were doing the right thing. But in reality, they had allowed their fear to shape their decisions, leading them down a path that could never be undone. As they drove home, the quiet between them was suffocating. They had been given the truth, but the damage was already done, and now there was no turning back. The truth hit harder than anything else. Jerome had done the unthinkable, and now he had to live with the consequences. He had failed his son when Aiden needed him most. He had failed to see the signs, failed to understand the depth of his son's pain. Instead of being a protector, he had been a coward, acting on fear, blinded by his own misconceptions. The silence in their home was suffocating. Jerome could hardly breathe as the realization sank in. His son was gone, and he had a part in it. There was no forgiveness for what he had done. Tiffany was sitting on the edge of their bed, her knees drawn to her chest, holding Aiden's hoodie in her hands. The fabric, once soft and comforting, now felt like an unbearable weight. She had seen the journal, she had read Aiden's words, and like Jerome, she had misunderstood him. She had been blinded by the same fear, the same protective instinct. But the guilt was different for her. She hadn't been the one to physically push him, to almost take his life, but the feeling of loss, of complete failure consumed her just as much. "We failed him," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Her tears stained the hoodie, and for a moment, she allowed herself to grieve for the son they had lost, for the life they had destroyed. But then her voice shifted. The sorrow that had weighed so heavily on her seemed to harden, transforming into something else, something darker. "But we don't have to fail justice," she said, her words firm and resolute. It was as if a switch had flipped in her mind. Jerome looked up at his wife, his eyes bloodshot, the rage bubbling beneath the surface. The pain of losing Aiden, of realizing the depths of his son's suffering, had turned into something much more dangerous. The guilt had twisted into fury, and now it was a fire that consumed him entirely. His son had been wronged, tormented for months, and the people responsible for that torment had to pay. His fists clenched, and he could feel the rage boiling inside him. Every ounce of that protective instinct now twisted into a violent thirst for revenge. The tormentors, Thomas, Tiffany, Malik, they had to pay for what they had done. Aiden had been failed by so many, including them, and now it was their turn to feel what it was like to be powerless, to be hurt in a way that could never be undone. Jerome stood up, his body tense, his face twisted with a mixture of grief and fury. He had made up his mind. The decision was clear. They would hunt down those responsible, one by one. They would make them feel the same pain Aiden had felt. This wouldn't be a matter of justice, it would be about retribution. Tiffany didn't flinch. She was right there with him, her resolve just as strong. They had failed their son once, but they wouldn't fail him again. This time, they would make sure the ones who hurt Aiden would pay. With that, the darkness settled over them like a cloak, and they began their deadly journey, determined to make the world pay for what it had done to their child. The pain had already consumed them. The question now was whether their thirst for vengeance would ever be quenched. Their first stop was Thomas Parker. The boy who had choked Aiden in the locker room. The bully who had never once thought about the consequences of his actions. Jerome and Tiffany tracked him through their small town, watching from the shadows as he stepped out of a convenience store, oblivious to what was coming. They didn't hesitate. They stormed toward him with fury in their eyes, grabbing him by his collar and dragging him to the ground. Thomas fought back at first, shouting for help, but the strength of Jerome's grip was overwhelming. They beat him until his body went limp, until his voice was nothing more than a faint whimper. They took him to an enclosed area. Then, they tied him to a fence, just like Aiden had imagined in his journal. They set his shoes on fire, watching with cold satisfaction as the flames consumed them and Thomas's body, the rubber melting away. It was a ritual of revenge, a grim symbol of what Aiden had endured. The smoke rose into the air, and in their twisted sense of justice, it felt like the weight of the years of bullying was finally burning away. The next target was Tiffany Myers, the girl who had spat on Aiden in front of the whole cafeteria, humiliating him in front of his peers. They adopted her from her parents' house and shoved her into the trunk of their car and drove for hours, the silence between them thick with anger. Hours later, her body was discovered, hanging upside down from a tree, drenched in blood. Jerome and Tiffany didn't speak a word as they watched the horror unfold. The world in their eyes was now a place of brutal reckoning. Every action they took was a repayment, an eye for an eye, and there was more to come. Malik Dawson, the last on their list, was the most chilling of all. He had been the one to dunk Aiden's head in the toilet and flush it, laughing with his friends as Aiden's body trembled in humiliation. He had been the one who, along with Thomas and Tiffany, had made Aiden's life a nightmare. But Malik was going to pay the highest price for what he had done. They found him taking a stroll down an alley. Jerome and Tiffany didn't waste time with words. They forced him into a car, taking him to a remote location. There, in the middle of nowhere, they dug his own grave. The ground was hard and unforgiving, just like the pain Aiden had endured. Malik too begged for mercy, but his cries were drowned out by the sound of his own shovel striking the earth. Once the grave was ready, they threw him into it, burying him alive with nothing but Aiden's photo pressed to his chest. It was a final act of vengeance, an unspoken symbol of the suffering Malik had caused. As the dirt was shoveled over him, his muffled cries were silenced, and the weight of his actions, like the weight of the other bullies, was buried forever. For Jerome and Tiffany, there was no remorse, no regret. What they had done, they believed, was justified. Aiden had been the victim, and these were the ones who had tormented him, broken him, and made him suffer. In their eyes, this was the only justice that could be had. The world might see it as murder, but for them it was payback, a brutal, unforgiving response to the years of torment their son had faced. As they drove away from each of these grim scenes, there was a hollow emptiness that followed them. They had done what they had set out to do, but it didn't bring Aiden back. It didn't undo the past, and no matter how much blood they spilled, the damage was irreversible. Detective Bruce Harris had been on the case from the beginning, watching as the investigation unfolded with a growing sense of unease. He was no stranger to violent crimes. He had dealt with murders and missing persons in his years of service. But something about this case felt different. Something about the brutality and the symbolism of the deaths gnawed at him, as if there was a story being told that was hiding just beneath the surface. He began to dig deeper, silently piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. At first, it was the manner of the killings. Each victim had been humiliated in some way, their deaths fitting into a grotesque pattern. The connections were too clear to ignore, too intentional to be random. Detective Harris started to make a list. All the victims were connected to one person, Aiden Carter. The more he investigated, the more it became apparent that someone was hunting down the bullies who had tormented the boy. It wasn't just revenge, it was a message, a personal vendetta. Harris kept his suspicions to himself, quietly gathering evidence. He knew that if he revealed too much too soon, it could alert the killers. His mind turned back to Jerome and Tiffany Carter, the parents of Aiden. The more Harris dug, the more the pieces began to fit. There were reports of the parents' involvement in various parts of town around the time each of the killings occurred. Jerome's unusual behavior, Tiffany's sudden silence after Aiden's death, it all pointed to one thing. They were not just grieving parents, they were the orchestrators of these killings. A breakthrough came when Harris found a clue that sent a chill down his spine. A local store surveillance video showing Jerome and Tiffany together, buying supplies at the convenience store. The same Thomas was adopted. It was enough to convince Harris that they were involved, and soon, it became clear that the couple had been the ones behind the deaths all along. The investigation took a darker turn as Harris and his team began to track Jerome and Tiffany's movements, but they were always one step ahead. The couple had become masters of evasion, disappearing into the shadows whenever they sensed danger. But their time was running out. Harris had finally connected the dots, and now, it was only a matter of time before they would have to answer for the brutal acts they had carried out in the name of revenge. The murders shocked the town, sending ripples of fear and confusion through the community. Initially, the police labeled the deaths as vigilante killings, an act of retaliation for the brutal bullying Aiden had suffered. But the town, small and close-knit, didn't know how to react. Some saw Jerome and Tiffany as heroes, parents who had taken matters into their own hands when the system failed them. These people viewed the deaths as justice, believing that no one else would have acted when Aiden had been let down by both his school and his family. They saw Jerome and Tiffany as the last line of defense, protecting their child in the only way they knew how. But for others, the story was far darker. They saw two cold-blooded killers who had taken the law into their own hands, showing no mercy to the people responsible for their son's torment. The idea of parents committing such brutal acts of violence in the name of revenge shook the town to its core. The killings didn't feel like justice. They felt like murder. And the fact that Jerome and Tiffany had gone to such extremes made their actions feel even more chilling. In the eyes of many, they were no better than the very bullies who had tormented Aiden in the first place. As the weeks passed, the town became divided. Jerome and Tiffany became infamous. They were now names spoken in hushed tones, whispered about at dinner tables and in the streets. Some people placed flowers outside their home, leaving notes of support. Others spray-painted their house with derogatory messages, calling them monsters. The complex web of emotions and judgments made it impossible to tell whether they were heroes or villains. And all the while, Jerome and Tiffany were on the run. Their names, once familiar and ordinary, were now cursed and celebrated in equal measure. They had no home, no place to hide. The police were closing in, but they knew it was only a matter of time before their past caught up with them. They had become fugitives, moving from place to place, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering if the next knock at the door would be their last. The police investigation was relentless, but it led them down a trail of dead ends. The official story was clear. The murders appeared to be revenge killings, crimes of passion carried out by a grieving mother and father. But the deeper they dug, the less they understood about the true motives behind the killings. There was no clear evidence of who had truly orchestrated the deaths, and no one could answer why the brutal acts had been carried out in such a symbolic manner. No one knew the full truth. No one except Jerome and Tiffany. The truth of Aiden's suffering, the years of bullying he had endured in silence, the desperation he felt, and the dreams of revenge he had poured into his journal. No one knew about the journal, about the twisted fantasy Aiden had written down as a way to cope with his pain. No one understood the psychological toll that had led to this point. They only saw the violence, the brutality, the aftermath. But even as the police closed in and the town wrestled with its divided views of justice, the truth was slowly being erased, buried in the rubble of what had already been done. Aiden's suffering had ended with his death, and Jerome and Tiffany had become prisoners of their own making, trapped in a nightmare that would never let them wake up. No one would ever fully comprehend the cost of their actions, not just on the victims, but on themselves. And in the end, no amount of revenge could bring Aiden back. Story 4. October 18th, 2014. It was supposed to be a visit of love and promise. A woman bringing her newborn twin boys to meet their father for the very first time. A prison visitation room, separated by glass but joined by hope. That's what it was meant to be. She dressed them in matching blue onesies, packed a bottle, a blanket, and a small photo of the nursery she finished while he was away. She smiled at the guard like she had nothing to hide. She looked into Jeremiah's eyes like everything was still intact. But when she held up the babies to the glass and turned their tiny faces toward him, everything in him stopped. There, on each of their faces, was a mark that he knew too well. Not because he had it, because felt borrowed. And in that silence, a plan was already forming. This is how it begins. There were just two brothers growing up on the edge of Birmingham. Jeremiah and Caleb Knox, born 4 years apart, raised in a 2-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a brick housing unit that shook when trains passed 2 blocks away. Their mother, Diane Knox, worked double shifts at Mercy General Hospital, mopping hallways by night, folding linens by morning. Their father had been gone since Caleb was still in diapers. Some said he'd left. Others said he was taken by the street. Either way, the boys grew up knowing not to wait for him to come back. Jeremiah, the older one, carried the silence that comes from watching your mother work herself to exhaustion without ever complaining. He did the grocery shopping by age 10. He got Caleb dressed for school, packed their lunches, made sure the gas bill was paid on time with the few extra dollars their mother scraped together. They attended Booker T. Washington Elementary, a school where overcrowded classrooms and aging textbooks were the norm. But Jeremiah didn't complain. He kept his head down, made honor roll, and got noticed early for his discipline. Teachers used to say he had the manners of someone twice his age. Caleb, on the other hand, walked into classrooms like a spotlight followed him. He had jokes nicknamed Swagger. He didn't care for homework, but he could talk his way out of nearly anything. He bounced between detentions and in-school suspensions like it was just part of the rhythm. But even then, Jeremiah didn't judge him. If Caleb got in trouble, Jeremiah showed up for the meetings. If Caleb needed lunch money, Jeremiah handed over his own without a word. He wasn't just a brother. He was the safety net. In high school, Jeremiah attended Jefferson Prep Magnet, small classes, college prep focus, structured environment. He thrived. By junior year, he was working part-time at a local auto shop and saving for community college. He wasn't chasing big dreams, just stability. He earned his associate degree in mechanical engineering from Lawson State, then picked up steady work as a systems tech for a local heating and cooling company. Blue collar, reliable, consistent. That was Jeremiah. Caleb went to the same high school, but lasted only until 11th grade. He got into it with a teacher, got suspended, and never came back. Started running around with a group of boys from across town who lived fast and played dirty. Stolen goods, boosting cars, selling electronics out of trunks. At 19, Caleb got picked up for armed theft. It wasn't clean, and it almost cost him years, but a first-time felony deal and a good public defender got him probation and community service. Diane cried in court. Jeremiah stood by him anyway. Jeremiah built things. Caleb broke them. Jeremiah saved. Caleb spent. But no matter how far apart they were, Jeremiah never stopped looking out for his brother. Even when Caleb burned bridges, Jeremiah stood at the other end with a bucket of water. He thought that's what big brothers were supposed to do. By the time they were in their late 20s, Jeremiah was married to Amira and living in a quiet rental duplex on the east side. He had a modest savings account, a dependable job, but the weight of their childhood never really left them. Caleb grew up knowing Jeremiah would always clean up the mess. That if the walls closed in, someone would take the hit. And Jeremiah, he had spent so long carrying his brother that when it came time to fall on the sword, he didn't hesitate. It wasn't instinct. It was learned behavior. Years of saying, "I've got it," whenever Caleb slipped. When Caleb's daughter was born in the fall of 2013, something in him shifted. He got a job at a warehouse. Started showing up on time, talked about staying clean. For the first time, it seemed like Caleb was settling down. Then came the night of April 7th, 2014. A robbery at a corner store turned violent. A man was shot. Surveillance footage was shaky. Witnesses were unsure, but a fingerprint lifted from the front door glass came back with a match. Caleb knocks. Police issued a warrant. He panicked. He called Jeremiah in the middle of the night, said it wasn't what it looked like, said he was only there to pick something up, that he didn't even see the gun until it was too late. Jeremiah listened. He didn't ask too many questions, didn't press for details. He just went quiet. The next morning, Jeremiah stopped by his mother's house, dropped off some groceries, and hugged her longer than usual. That evening, he met Caleb behind the old Baptist church near where they grew up. No one else was around. Caleb paced while Jeremiah stood still. Then, Jeremiah told him the words Caleb never expected to hear. "You've got a daughter now. I've got no record. If I take the hit, you'll stay out and build your life. Don't waste this." Caleb said no, told him it was too much. But Jeremiah had already decided. This wasn't the first time he'd cleaned up his brother's mess. It was just the first time it would cost him everything. Later that night, Jeremiah returned home. Amira was asleep on the couch, one hand resting on her stomach. He sat next to her for a while without saying a word. Then he kissed her forehead, got up, and walked out the door. The next morning, he turned himself in. April 10th, 2014. Jeremiah walked into the Birmingham Police Department just after lunch. No lawyer. No explanation. Just a man with a straight face, and a plan no one could have imagined. He gave his name, sat down in the interview room, and told the detectives he was responsible for the robbery on 3rd Avenue that left a man in critical condition. He said he acted alone, said he didn't mean for it to go that far, said he panicked. He told the story without hesitation, like he'd rehearsed it 100 times in his head. And when they slid the confession across the table, he signed it. There was no bargaining, no back and forth, no emotion. Just a quiet man handing over his life. They took his fingerprints, booked him, and by sundown, Jeremiah Knox was in a county cell facing 5 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. No one asked why he was doing it. No one looked closer. No one realized the truth. He was doing it for someone else. Amira didn't find out until the arrest made the local news. By then it was too late. She stood across the street from the precinct as Jeremiah was walked out in handcuffs. She was 6 months pregnant, standing still on the sidewalk, unable to move. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just watched. And she knew. She didn't need to hear the details. She knew who this was really for. Caleb never showed his face at the precinct. He stayed silent. He went back to work the next day, picked up his daughter from daycare, smiled like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something irreversible. His brother was gone. And now the countdown had begun. Because while Jeremiah sat behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, the world outside kept moving. And soon enough, he'd learned that what he thought was a sacrifice was just the beginning of everything he was about to lose. Amira Thompson was raised in a military home where silence carried weight and discipline wasn't optional. Her father, a retired Marine, kept the house in order with the same structure he learned in the service. Early mornings, folded sheets, no excuses. Her mother was softer but firm. A teacher who demanded effort and excellence in everything Amira did. She was the only child, quiet but observant. Never the one to act out, but always the one who noticed. Her childhood wasn't cold, but it was orderly, measured. Love was shown in actions, not words. That's probably why she fell for Jeremiah Knox. He wasn't loud. He didn't chase attention. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. But when he said something, he meant it. She met him in high school. They had the same homeroom. He walked her to her bus a few times before asking her out. Their first date was to a museum, and he paid for everything with a $20 bill he'd earned fixing a neighbor's heater. He was steady even then. They dated for 6 years before he proposed, on a Sunday afternoon in her parents' backyard. No fireworks, no audience. Just Jeremiah, her, and a small silver ring he said reminded him of her calm. They got married in the church she grew up in. A modest brick building with white painted shutters and a narrow steeple that had weathered more than a few Alabama storms. The kind of place where Sunday service still started with hymns and ended with folding chairs being stacked by teenagers in pressed jeans. Amira had walked those aisles since she was a little girl, clutching her mother's hand during altar calls and helping her father hand out programs at the door. It was the only place that ever truly felt like home to her, and when Jeremiah asked where she wanted to say her vows, she didn't hesitate. The wedding wasn't expensive. Jeremiah insisted on paying for everything himself. He picked up extra shifts, skipped new clothes, and sold his old car to help cover the reception. There were no limousines, no destination honeymoon, but the pews were filled with people who knew their story. Teachers who'd seen them grow up, neighbors who remembered them as kids, and a choir that sang louder than the organ could keep up with. Amira wore her mother's veil. Jeremiah wore a gray suit he'd tailored himself with his tax return. And when he saw her walk down that aisle he cried, not loud, not theatrical, just one tear that slipped down his cheek as he whispered, "That's my wife." For a while it was perfect. She became a school counselor at Glenwood Middle, working mostly with 7th and 8th graders, while Jeremiah kept his job with the HVAC company. They came home tired but happy. Dinner on the couch, laughter over takeout, arguments over what to name their future kids. It was a life they both built slowly without shortcuts. The twins were a surprise. She found out on a rainy Tuesday, called him crying with joy, and he left work early just to hold her. They painted the nursery gray. Everything felt like it was finally coming together, until the knock came on their door and everything stopped. When Jeremiah went to prison, Amira's world didn't just slow down, it collapsed in place. One minute she was folding baby clothes, the next she was staring at a news headline with her husband's name in bold. She didn't understand it. He hadn't warned her. He hadn't told her about Caleb's trouble. He just left. No explanation. No plan. Just vanished into a courtroom and never came home. And now she was 6 months pregnant, alone, and surrounded by whispers. Friends stopped calling. Her parents asked questions she didn't have answers for. Nights stretched into mornings. Mornings felt heavier than they used to. She still went to work, still smiled for her students. But at home, it was just silence and the weight of everything she didn't understand. Caleb showed up the first week after Jeremiah's sentencing, said he wanted to help. Said he'd do what he could while Jeremiah was gone. He brought groceries, fixed the loose cabinet, replaced the batteries in the smoke detector. It was small things at first. Just errands. Then he started coming more often, bringing food, helping put together the crib, talking about how much Jeremiah meant to him, how guilty he felt for not stepping up, how he'd never let her go through this alone. She never expected to rely on Caleb. But the loneliness crept in slow. She was tired. Her feet ached. The babies kicked at night, and sometimes she cried without knowing why. Caleb started staying longer, sitting beside her on the couch, listening more than talking. He never crossed a line, not at first. But the line kept moving, and soon it was hard to tell where it had been in the first place. Flashbacks filled her head in those moments. Her wedding day. Jeremiah's voice reading baby name books aloud. The way he smiled when she told him she was pregnant. Those memories started to feel distant. Like a life she used to know but couldn't return to. Caleb filled the space that Jeremiah left behind. Slowly. Gently. Consistently. She told herself it was nothing. That it didn't mean anything. That she was just grateful. But gratitude started to look a lot like dependence. July 17th, 2014. Just after 6 a.m. Amira's water broke on the couch while she was watching the morning news. The contractions came fast. Strong. Closer together than she expected. She tried to reach her phone, but the pain stole her breath before she could speak. She finally managed to call Caleb, and he answered on the first ring. He was already on his way. He lived 10 minutes down the road and got there in 5. She didn't ask how. She didn't ask why he was up so early. All she knew was she needed to get to the hospital, and Jeremiah wasn't there. Caleb helped her into the car, one hand guiding her down the steps, the other gripping the wheel so tight, the skin around his knuckles turned pale. Amira didn't much during the drive. Just closed her eyes and breathed, clutching her belly as Caleb sped through yellow lights and didn't stop once until they reached Birmingham Women's Medical. The nurses were waiting. He helped check her in. He gave her name. He signed the intake form. The staff assumed he was the father, and he didn't correct them. By 11:47 a.m., Elijah Knox entered the world crying and strong. Emmanuel followed 2 minutes later, smaller but just as loud. The room was filled with the sounds of new life and quiet awe. Amira sobbed as she held both boys against her chest. At that moment, it didn't matter who had driven her there. It didn't matter who had cut the cords. The babies were breathing. She was alive. The delivery was over. But the silence came back quickly. Later that afternoon, a pediatric nurse named Tasha rolled in with a clipboard and a smile, doing the standard newborn check. She lifted the boys gently, logging their weight, noting their breathing, checking their reflexes. Then she paused. She leaned in, frowning softly, brushing her thumb across the same small spot on both of their noses. A round, deep brown mole, no larger than a pencil eraser. She didn't say much at first, just circled it in her chart, then looked over at Amira with a curious expression. "You said the father's name is Jeremiah," she asked. Amira nodded quickly, her smile returning too fast, her eyes avoiding the nurse's. "Yes," she said. "Jeremiah Knox." The nurse nodded back. "Okay, just making sure. It's rare that they both have the same mark in the exact same spot. But genetics are funny like that, I guess." Amira forced a laugh. "Yeah, real funny." Then she turned away and pretended to adjust her blanket. But the tension didn't leave the room. It sat with them, quiet, heavy, unspoken. The nurse finished her check and left without pressing further, but she made a note in the system. Unusual, identical marks. Unconfirmed paternal resemblance. Not a red flag. Just an observation. Amira didn't mention it to anyone. She told herself it didn't mean anything. That it was just a coincidence. She had cousins who shared birthmarks. Her father had one on his arm. Maybe this was some recessive gene. Maybe Jeremiah's baby photos were wrong. She told herself whatever she needed to get through the night. And by morning, she had convinced herself not to think about it again. Caleb returned later that day with flowers and a stuffed elephant. He held the boys like he'd done it 100 times before, rocking them gently while Amira watched from the bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked her hair behind her ears. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But when he looked down at the boys and saw the mole, his eyes froze for half a second too long. Amira noticed. She watched his face. Watched how he blinked twice and looked away. He didn't ask questions. He didn't mention it. Just smiled and kissed Elijah on the forehead before laying him gently back in the bassinet. He held Emmanuel next, even closer. The nurses continued to treat Caleb as the father. He didn't correct them. Not once. And Amira didn't either. That night, when the hospital quieted and the hallway lights dimmed, Amira stayed awake, staring at the ceiling while twins slept beside her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jeremiah's face through the glass. Not the smiling version from their wedding. Not the one from the ultrasound appointments. But the version she imagined now. Cold. Betrayed. Quiet. She tried to picture how he would react. What he would say if he saw the boys and noticed the mark. But the thought was too sharp. Too real. So she forced herself to think of something else. She picked up the hospital form and filled out the birth certificate details slowly. Mother, Amira Knox. Father, Jeremiah Knox. She paused over the line, hesitated, then kept writing. She told herself the lie had already started, and changing the name now wouldn't undo what had been done. But somewhere deep inside, she knew. Even if Jeremiah never saw the mole, even if he never asked the question, he would feel the answer. Because the kind of truth she was trying to hide doesn't stay buried. It waits, and eventually it opens its eyes. October 18th, 2014. It had been just over 6 months since Jeremiah Knox was sentenced, and 3 months since his twin sons had been born. That morning, the visitation room at St. Clair Correctional Facility was unusually quiet. Jeremiah had woken up before sunrise, shaved carefully in the cracked mirror above the sink in his cell, and put on the cleanest uniform he had. He didn't say much to anyone that day. Not his bunkmate. Not the guard who escorted him. All he said was, "My wife's bringing the kids today." He was led to the visitation wing at 10:02 a.m. They placed him at the far end of the row, beneath a dim flickering light where the glass was less scratched than the rest. He sat down, picked up the phone, and waited. Amira arrived 8 minutes later. She walked in wearing a black hoodie and gray jeans, her face pale from exhaustion, her hair tied up quickly like she hadn't looked in a mirror before leaving the house. She carried 2 infant car seats, one in each hand. Her body looked thinner, weaker, stretched thin from sleep deprivation and the weight of everything she'd held alone. She didn't speak at first, just nodded, lowered the carriers to the table in front of the glass, and turned them so Jeremiah could see inside. And there they were, Elijah and Emmanuel. 3 months old, sleeping peacefully in matching blue beanies, cheeks full, hands balled into tiny fists. Jeremiah's eyes softened immediately. He smiled, small and controlled, his breathing heavier now. For a brief second, the tension in his shoulders loosened. Then he saw it. A mole. Not on one baby. On both. Same size. Same location. The left side of their nose, right beside the curve of their nostrils. He blinked. His smile didn't move. His hands gripped the receiver tighter. He didn't say a word about it. Didn't ask a single question. But the moment froze in his mind like a photograph he couldn't unsee. Because he knew that mark. He'd seen it his entire life on Caleb. That birthmark had been part of his brother's face since they were kids. Their mother used to call it his trouble spot. Jeremiah never had one. Neither did his father. Neither did any baby picture he'd ever seen of himself. He nodded through Amira's voice. She was talking now. About feedings. About sleep patterns. About how Elijah smiled when he heard music. About how Emmanuel cried less when held upright. But her eyes didn't meet his for long. Every sentence came with a pause. Like she was waiting for him to say something he wasn't saying. He didn't ask. Not then. He complimented the boys' names. Names they'd picked together before he was locked away. He asked if she was eating. Asked if she needed anything. Told her he'd write her a letter. But the softness in his voice was gone. Something underneath had shifted. He spoke slower. Shorter. He hung up first. That night, Jeremiah didn't eat dinner. Didn't go out to the yard. Didn't sleep. He sat on his bunk staring at the ceiling while the image of those 2 tiny faces burned into his mind. The same mark. Twice. On the same side. From a man who'd been helping Amira every day since the birth. From the only person he had protected more than his own future. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. A rare coincidence. A genetic fluke. But even in the silence, he heard his own voice whispering what he wasn't ready to admit. After that visit, everything changed. The letters stopped being warm. The words were shorter, tighter. The calls were colder. He didn't ask about her anymore. Only the boys. His responses were clipped. The jokes disappeared. Outside those prison walls, Caleb's presence deepened. Neighbors saw him more than they saw Amira. He was always there, holding one child on his hip, the other in a carrier strapped to his chest. He ran errands, answered the door, tucked the boys in at night. He started to refer to himself as Uncle Daddy, brushing it off with a laugh. But the looks he gave the babies weren't jokes. They were proud, intimate, like a man who already knew. People in the community didn't ask. They just started treating it like fact. The man in the house was Caleb. The boys knew his voice. Amira had stopped correcting anyone, and Jeremiah, sitting behind concrete walls and a steel door, could feel it all happening. Letter by letter, call by call. He had gone to prison to save his brother. And now, with every passing day, he was watching his brother take the one thing he thought would still be waiting for him when he got out. The next visit didn't come until 6 weeks later. It was December 6th. Cold. Wind sliding across the fence outside St. Clair. Jeremiah waited by the door early, cleaned his shoes, shaved with the dull razor they handed out on Saturdays. When he was finally called in, he walked into the visitation room with quiet hope, eyes scanning for those tiny car seats. But when he saw Amira step in, alone, something inside him sank. No babies, no diaper bags, no cooing sounds from behind the glass. Just her. She sat down gently, smoothed the hem of her coat, and picked up the phone before he could ask. She was already explaining. Said the twins were with her mom. That the last visit had been too much, and she didn't want to drag them out into the cold. Said they were heavy now, and it wasn't easy. He nodded and smiled and said he understood. But he didn't. Not really. In one call during the 3rd year, he finally asked directly, "Do the boys ask about me?" The pause was so long he thought the line dropped. Then she said, "Sometimes." He didn't ask again after that. He could hear it in her voice. The distance. The absence. The discomfort of trying to answer something she didn't want to lie about, but wouldn't tell the truth either. By the 4th year, the visit stopped altogether. The only time he saw someone from his old life was when his mother came down that spring. She was slower now, her eyes a little dimmer. They sat across the glass, and she talked about church, about the neighborhood. Then she mentioned she had seen the boys recently. Over at Caleb's house. Not Amira's. Caleb's. Jeremiah leaned forward, stared at her. Why were they at Caleb's? She looked down then said, "I don't want to get in the middle of anything." He didn't ask more. He didn't have to. That night, he laid in bed without moving for hours. He replayed every letter, every visit, every call. All the time she said they were with Grandma, and now he knew what she meant. Grandma wasn't always her mother. There with Grandma became a phrase that didn't need explaining. It was her way of buying time, her way of softening the truth. A phrase that kept him hopeful while the truth lived somewhere else, outside, in a house he'd never returned to, under a roof where his brother stood in his place. He had gone to prison believing he was saving someone's future, but now he was starting to see what had been taken from him piece by piece. It wasn't just his time. It wasn't just his freedom. It was his name, his home, his sons. May 5th, 2019. After 5 years, 1 month, and 25 days, Jeremiah Knox walked out of St. Clair Correctional Facility. He stepped through the gates just after 7 a.m. The air was damp. The ground smelled like rain and dust. He wore the same shoes he went in with, soles worn nearly smooth, and carried a plastic bag with everything he owned, 2 letters, a Bible, and a faded photo of Amira from the day they got married. He waited for someone. For anyone. But there was no one there. No Amira. No boys. No car. Just silence and a bus schedule taped to a rusted pole near the exit. May 6th, 2019. The door opened before he even knocked. Amira stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, lips parted, frozen in a stare somewhere between disbelief and guilt. But Jeremiah didn't hesitate. He smiled softly, politely, and stepped forward with open arms. "I'm home," he said. She hugged him, brief, tight, awkward. She stepped aside and let him walk in. It wasn't a grand reunion. There were no balloons, no kids running into his arms, no welcome banner. But it was quiet, and it was warm. That was enough. For now. The living room smelled like cinnamon and detergent. The couch was new. The walls were a different color. He noticed, but said nothing. There were baby photos everywhere. Elijah and Emmanuel at 1, at 3, at 4. He stopped and stared at one of them for just a moment too long. It was framed above the fireplace. The twins in matching shirts, standing in front of a birthday cake. Caleb was in the background, smiling wide. His hand rested on one of the boys' shoulders. Jeremiah blinked, forced the smile again. Over the next few days, he settled in quietly. He unpacked what little he had, helped with dishes, picked up groceries, even cooked once. He was soft-spoken, grateful, present. But deep inside, his mind never stopped working. Every hug felt like a question. Every photo a hint. Every time the boys called him Daddy, he felt the sting behind his ribs. The mole still there. Both of them. Left side. Always visible. Always reminding him of what he didn't want to believe. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after he got home, Amira left early for work. The boys were at school. Jeremiah stood in the bathroom, staring at the sink. 2 hairbrushes, one green, one blue. He picked them up gently, plucked 2 long strands of hair, folded them in a tissue, sealed them in a sandwich bag. He didn't take them to a local lab. Not this time. He sent them out of state. Quiet. Discreet. Paid in cash. No return address. And then he waited. 1 week later, the envelope finally came. He held it in his hand for hours before opening it. The answer? 0%. They weren't his. Not Elijah. Not Emmanuel. Jeremiah didn't speak. He didn't scream. He sat at the kitchen table in silence, the report spread before him like a death certificate. It didn't feel like rage. It felt like loss. Real, undeniable, irreversible loss. August 4th, 2019. Jeremiah Knox told Amira he wanted to host a dinner to celebrate being home. Said it had been too long since everyone sat together as a family. He told her to make it special. She wore a navy dress. He set the table himself. 2 candles, white linen napkins, soft jazz playing low through the Bluetooth speaker in the corner. The boys were tucked into their room early, already fed. He said he wanted them to have their rest. He said the evening was about adults. About closure, peace, and fresh starts. Caleb arrived just before 7 p.m. Casual as ever. Jeans, sneakers, a smirk that barely faded. He greeted Jeremiah like nothing had ever happened. Sat down like he'd been invited 100 times before. They talked like brothers. About old memories, about football, about the neighborhood. Amira served chicken and roasted potatoes. Jeremiah offered a toast, lifting his glass, eyes flicking between the 2 people seated across from him. The ones who had rewritten his life while he sat behind concrete walls. To family, he said. They raised their glasses, clinked, took small sips. Then he put his glass down. The air changed. The smile on Jeremiah's face disappeared. He looked at Caleb, not with rage, but with certainty. You thought I wouldn't find out, he said quietly. His voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It landed like a stone. But I did. Amira froze. Caleb looked up slowly, his brow beginning to crease. Jeremiah leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the table. I did a test from the hairbrush private laboratory. The results came back. He exhaled. The twins. They're not mine. No one moved. I know they're yours, Caleb, he continued, eyes locked in. It's evident. And you know what? I don't even care how it happened anymore. The lies. The silence. The visits that stopped. All of it. I spent 5 years rotting away in a cage while you were here. Raising the children I thought were mine. Laying beside my wife. Living in my home. He reached under his seat. What came out wasn't a threat. It was a verdict. A cold steel pistol. Amira gasped. Caleb stood up, hands raised, backing away. But Jeremiah didn't flinch. I'm going to fix it, he said, like I always do. He fired once. The bullet hit Caleb directly in the chest. The sound shattered the room. Amira screamed, running, but before she could even kneel beside him, Jeremiah turned and pulled the trigger again. She fell without a sound. 2 bodies. 2 silences. Then, he walked toward the hallway. The boys were still awake. One of them had cracked the bedroom door open, peeking through. They had heard the noise. The cries. The collapse. Jeremiah stood in the doorway watching them. Elijah stepped forward. Daddy? He blinked. It was the first time in weeks that word had broken him. But his face stayed calm. His voice level. You won't hurt like I did, he whispered. He raised the gun once more. 2 shots. 2 small bodies. No more confusion. No more wondering. No more betrayal hiding behind baby photos. To Jeremiah, it was the final cleansing. He placed the gun on the kitchen counter, sat in his old chair, and waited for the silence to settle. Because to him, justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, final, and done by his own hand. August 4th, 2019. Just after 8:12 p.m., a neighbor named Linda Rollins, who lived 2 doors down, was walking her dog when she heard what she thought were fireworks. 3 quick pops, a pause, then 2 more. Her dog flinched. She stopped, looked toward the Knox residence, and saw the porch light flicker off. She stood still for a moment, unsure. But then she heard something else. One last sound. Closer. Heavier. Like a door slamming shut or a body hitting the floor. That's when she called 911. By 8:19 p.m., patrol units were dispatched. Officers arrived on scene by 8:26. They knocked once. No answer. Then again. Still nothing. The door was unlocked. What they found inside was unlike anything they were prepared for. The first body was in the dining room. Caleb Knox, 30 years old. Single gunshot wound to the chest. Still seated upright in the chair, one hand resting on the table, eyes open. A plate of half-eaten food sat in front of him. He hadn't even had time to stand. A few feet away, Amira Knox slumped forward, her arm extended in his direction. 1 bullet to the abdomen. No signs of struggle. No defensive wounds. It was fast. They followed the hallway next. The boys' bedroom door was cracked open. Inside were the bodies of Elijah and Emmanuel, just 5 years old. Both tucked in their beds. No signs of chaos. As if they'd been placed there gently after it happened. 1 shot each. In the kitchen, Jeremiah Knox sat alone at the table. The pistol was on the counter. The safety was on. His hands were resting in front of him. Palms open. Eyes blank. He didn't resist arrest. Didn't ask questions. Didn't blink when the cuffs went on. The officers asked what happened. He didn't answer. In the back of the patrol car, he stared out the window the entire ride. Never asked where they were taking him. Never asked for a lawyer. At 9:52 p.m., seated in the interview room, the detective leaned forward and said, "Jeremiah, help us understand this. Why tonight? Why them?" Jeremiah sat still for a long time. Silent. Then, in a voice so quiet the microphone barely caught it, he spoke. "I died in that prison. They just buried what was left." And then he said nothing else. November 2nd, 2019. The courtroom was silent as Jeremiah Knox was led in, shackled at the wrists. His orange jumpsuit pressed but faded. His eyes hollow. He didn't look toward the gallery. Didn't scan the benches for familiar faces. He walked like a man carrying weight no sentence could add to. The people seated inside, family members, neighbors, teachers, co-workers, watched in stillness. Some stared. Others looked away. His mother, Diane Knox, sat on the 3rd bench from the front. A scarf wrapped around her head, hands trembling, tears streaming without pause. She had lived long enough to bury dreams, but never imagined she'd live to see both her sons taken from her in one night. One by death, the other by the consequence of trying to fix what was never his to carry. The prosecution moved quickly. They painted Jeremiah as deliberate, calculating, and methodical. They showed the dinner as premeditated. They outlined how he invited his brother under the guise of reconciliation. The defense argued mental break. They described a man pushed beyond the edge of sanity. They told the story the jury hadn't heard yet, the story of sacrifice, silence, and betrayal. They showed the DNA results. Described the years Jeremiah spent watching his life be replaced in real time. Said he was a father robbed of fatherhood. A husband traded for a brother. They called it a psychotic episode, a collapse of emotional containment, triggered by truth hitting too late. They didn't try to cold personal. Said a man who could walk down a hallway and shoot 2 children in their beds didn't need mercy. He needed walls, bars, and a sentence that would never expire. No parole, no chance of appeal, no return to the world he'd already broken. November 7th, 2019. After 5 days, the verdict came in. Guilty on all counts for murders, 1st degree, aggravated circumstances. Jeremiah never flinched. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood, cleared his throat, and spoke only one sentence. "You can only bury a man once, but you all watched me die twice." Then he sat back down. He was sentenced to life in prison, without parole, without the possibility of release. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't gasp. It just exhaled like something had finally ended, even if it never really would. The days after the murders were filled with questions. The community of Birmingham was shaken. Neighbors who once passed the Knox brothers on their front porches now whispered about betrayal and bloodshed. Vigils were held for the children, for Amira. Some left flowers outside the house. Others crossed the street to avoid it. The story didn't just divide the city. It split families, friendships, even churches. Some said Jeremiah was a monster. Others said he was a broken man who had given too much for people who didn't deserve him. Old friends from high school remembered Jeremiah as calm, reliable, deeply protective. But after the verdict, that memory began to fracture. Some said he went too far, that no amount of betrayal justified what he did, that those children, regardless of blood, were innocent. Others, however, spoke differently. Quietly, privately. They said if the story were true, if everything he gave was met with silence and deception, then maybe what happened wasn't about revenge. Maybe it was about collapse. A man who gave everything and finally had nothing left to lose. Jeremiah's mother never spoke publicly after the trial. At the funeral, she sat between 4 caskets. Her sons, her daughter-in-law, her grandchildren. Her silence was louder than any words that could have been offered. The media called it the Knox family tragedy.
As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.